podcast, this will be on my podcast if you don't want to watch the whole thing on Facebook and you would rather listen passively in the car, which is my favorite way to listen to podcasts. Teri, do you listen to podcasts since you do one?
I do. Yep. I listen to podcasts all the time. So often when I'm researching, not only am I reading books and I read all kinds of like academic journals. Um, I also like take stuff from, just like coaching sessions and things that I've discovered myself. But then I also listen to a lot of podcasts on topics that are related in different fields because this is a brand new field. So
Right.
yeah, so I have to like I take from like adoptive parents of traumatized children or like foster parenting or PTSD or like other kinds of trauma. And I take all of the research there and kind of apply it to what I know about religious trauma. Yeah.
Religious trauma is the new. Is that what you're saying is the new
Yeah.
genre?
Yeah. So we've only known about religious trauma. People started studying it 20 years ago, but it only got a name in 2011.
Wow.
It's like brand new.
Wow. And like, so not brand new.
Yeah.
So not brand new.
No, like people have had religious trauma as long as religion has been around, but yeah, like as far as us being aware of it, we've only been aware of PTSD since 1976. Like that's when PTSD got labeled and they started studying it in earnest. Someone had written a book about it in 1946, right after World War II. There was a psychiatrist that was noticing a lot of similar symptoms, but it wasn't until after the Vietnam War that another psychiatrist happened to read that book and said, "Oh my gosh, like I have similar things going on here." So, can you hear
The
me?
Body Keeps the Score? Is that from The Body Keeps the
Yeah.
Score? No.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I do remember that.
And that's when he started studying it. And so we've only known about PTSD since 1976, and that's about the time they started studying what makes a person healthy, not just abnormal psychology, but like what makes healthy people, not just unhealthy people. Um, and then, of course, we have Brene Brown that really transformed things when she started talking about shame. And she started talking about that in the mid 2000s. So, yeah, this is like
Love Brene Brown.
brand
For
new
anybody,
stuff.
yeah, listen. Brene Brown is such a G. She's such a G. I love her so much, and she's very inspiring, and she does the paradoxical. She pairs science with emotion, and it's just this beautiful. She just displays it like so beautifully, and she's such a good teacher.
Mm-hmm.
It's so funny with mental health. So they termed religious trauma in 2011, you said.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, religion has been here, if we're even just going off of Christianity, that hasn't even been here for more than the Bible was 2,400 years ago. Like not very long.
Not very long. So it was about 80 years after the death of Christ was like the first written version that we can find of one of the gospels, and then 200 years after that we see some more of the gospels, and then I don't know when it was all put together as a book, but that's when we start getting those first written papyri. Yeah
The books, the actual books started coming around. So religion has been around for so long, and the thing that popped into my mind was that cell phones became popular in like 2007, at least for me. That's when I got my first one. And I think that's when a lot of people started getting them. And that was only in 2007, but they already know what like cell phone thumb is. Like that's already a diagnosis. So funny. Mental health is such a strange topic. Okay. So Teri, I wanted to get this right. And so we talked about it after or before the show, and I'm really excited because we're going to go in a lot of really cool directions. Specifically, if we want to label Teri as a businesswoman, she is a religious transition and trauma recovery coach. I have known Teri personally for just under 2 years, and I've gotten to watch a little bit of Teri's blossoming, and it's been so fantastic and inspiring to see. We actually she had me on her top ranking. She ranked top 10% in the world in religious podcasts. Um, and she just had me on. It was such an honor to be on. And we had such a good discussion. That's actually coming out Sunday. So if you want to tell them, just real quick, tell them name of the podcast, where to get it.
Okay. So it's called the Emancipate Your Mind podcast, and it is on all of the podcast directories. So wherever you love to listen to podcasts, you can find the Emancipate Your Mind podcast. And it drops at 7 a.m. Mountain Time on Sunday mornings, every Sunday.
Wait.
Yeah.
I'm listening and I'm going to take notes. And I need to go back. So we were chatting before we press record, and we decided to title this Spiritual Transition. And maybe when the podcast comes out, it'll be titled something differently based on the conversation that Teri and I have. And we titled it Spiritual Transition over Religious Transition because we were chatting about how, in my story, for example, I had a religious transition, but it wasn't what one would think because I didn't actually leave a religion. I wasn't part of a church. I didn't go to congregation every week. And Teri's story is a lot different. And Teri's story is a lot what you would think of in religious tradition. And so we want to make it really clear for anybody listening, if you do come on, well, I don't think anybody's actually live at the moment.
We have two. Well, it's just you and me. It's just you and me.
Look at us. So if somebody does come on live, if you see, feel free to type in there. I want everybody to feel safe in asking questions because it's such a raw topic. And we just want everybody to feel that everybody has their own experience, and everybody has an experience in this in one way or another if they've taken on the value of spirituality in their life at all. Would you agree?
Absolutely. And when it comes to talking about spiritual transition or religious transition, it's such a personal journey, and we all learn from each other, even if our experiences are vastly different. And I know religion typically has been a very charged place where a lot of times people feel like they need to hide certain parts of themselves or hide certain beliefs. And my thinking is that when we can be completely open and honest about what we actually do think and do believe and what has worked for us and what isn't working for us, then we learn from each other and we make it a healthier space. So I'm always telling my clients, you're the authority in your own life and your experience is valid. So those are the things that even if your experience is nothing like anyone else's experience, it's valid because it's yours. It's what has actually happened in your life, and that story needs to be told so that we get a wider, more expansive understanding of religion in general and just the spiritual experience and just what's possible, and it just informs us and informs our own experience.
And the people listening to the Goldmine podcast, most of them would define themselves as leaders. And so I just really want to point out with exactly what you said, the experience is valid. It gets to be talked about. We get to learn how to speak heart-centered and all of these things. And as a leader, please believe that your experience is valid because you get to lead other people into believing their experience is valid. And so a memory came back into my head, Teri, when you were talking. When you were part of Firebird, the girls were, so Teri was part of this team. And the girls it was a team of entrepreneurs, all different types. And we had little rituals and we would celebrate each other. And I think the Firebird girls decided to do something that isn't coming to my mind. But at the time where Teri was, she was not interested in it because of where she was in her transition. She didn't feel comfortable with it. And what a leader Teri was in that moment, because I do know a lot of girls and guys and a lot of leaders who would have just gone with the flow to fit in. And Teri didn't do that. And she's like, listen, I'm going to take this, this, and this. I want you guys to know I'm going to leave this. Please don't take it personally. And she set that boundary so beautifully. And that's what leaders do. She was honest and she supported everybody else in their own process.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think one of the things that allows us to do that is when we have that self-trust and we've kind of rooted into who I am is completely acceptable as I am. I don't need to be something else in order to be acceptable. And I think when we belong to ourselves, that's the term that I use. When I belong to me and I'm the person that I get my validation from, and then it becomes a little easier to show up in that way and to say, this is what's okay with me and this is what's not. And honestly, like religious transition is what gave that to me, because before that, I got validation from other people and I didn't belong to myself. I belonged to an organization and I did what I needed to do to fit in. But learning to belong to myself has allowed me, again, coming back to Brene Brown, she talks about Maya Angelou in her book Braving the Wilderness, and she says something like, Maya had a quote that said, "I belong everywhere and nowhere," and that is what belonging to yourself is. Is when you belong to yourself, you belong everywhere because your belonging is centered in you, but you also don't belong anywhere, if that makes sense, because you're so individual and you're so unique that you don't fully belong anywhere.
I love that. I have not
Yeah.
read that book. So if you say I should, I will.
Honestly, going through transition, I would say it is the best book for transition. It just happened to be the one she published right as I was transitioning out or right before. So it was the next book I picked up of her. She's been sort of a touchstone throughout my entire journey of healing from clinical depression, figuring out who I am, leaving high demand religion, and then learning to lead. So her next book after Braving the Wilderness was Dare to Lead. And I read that right before I met you. So yeah.
Oh my gosh, I got the goosebumps again. And I don't get goosebumps like all the time. I'm not one of those. I'm not one of those women, at least not yet. Maybe I'm becoming.
You're just like so spiritually in tune. You're like,
I get a vibe with you. There's something about our conversations that I feel so they're very nourishing to me.
to me as well.
So I want to, this is what I'm thinking as far as where to move. I would like, because I think what we were saying before, spiritual and religious transition, like what the fuck is it even? And before we even go there, I want you to explain that. And before we go there, I want to talk emotionally, like you're doing it for a reason. And so whatever it is has made a change in your life. So if you could tell me without, because we are going to get into the story. I want to get into your story, both of our stories, just to show the difference. But I'm curious if you could share just the simplicities of how your life is different now versus before you transition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I belonged to a high demand religion. And what high demand religion is, all religion has some sort of control, but high demand religion is very authoritarian and fundamentalist and orthodox. And there are strict rules about what is okay and what is not okay, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. And I grew up in this environment. And what that did for me is that I put off certain parts of myself that didn't fit. So certain times, I mean, I can remember as early as like 5th grade having questions or doubts or things that didn't sit well with me, and knowing that that was not acceptable in the group. And so like I was actually just talking about this with my husband last night. I had moments where I knew that I was on dangerous ground and my brain literally shut down and like rebooted in that moment. It like shut down, like that's dangerous. If you do that, you're going to be kicked out of your tribe. You're going to be kicked out. Like you won't be welcome. And
Oh,
your
if
needs
you were to inquire or act a certain way. Okay.
or vocalize it or really like dig into it too much. And so my brain literally like would shut down and like reboot and distract myself with something else. So I had a few of those moments, and the one I can remember the most was in 5th grade history. We were learning Greek mythology, and I had a serious questioning moment where I had a moment where I was
Oh,
like,
yeah.
why didn't they go on top of Mount Olympus and see if the gods were there?
Mm-hmm.
And my teacher said, well, they thought that they would get struck down with lightning bolts, that Zeus would zap them with lightning. And I said, but all they like, I don't understand. Like they could have just climbed the mountain and seen, and then they would have known that there were no gods there, and they wouldn't have wasted their time being afraid of these gods. And I had this quick moment. I remember having this moment of, wait, have I ever climbed the mountain to check and see? Have I ever looked into it?
This
And
was
I
elementary
remember
school?
fifth grade. Yep.
Mm.
I remember having a panic moment and then just this kind of feeling of like just my
Ooh.
brain like shut down. And when I like, it's like I blanked out for a couple of minutes. And when I rebooted, like, it's like it had stuffed it down, packaged it up, put it away, and I was thinking about something else. Like it just
Wow.
disembodied. And so that's a long way of saying I spent a lot of years feeling disembodied because I wasn't completely allowed to be in touch with my own emotions, my own thoughts. There were parts of me that were considered dangerous to my belonging in the group. And so over time, as I put more and more of those parts away, I adopted more of the group identity, which in religious trauma, in religious trauma or mind control, we call it a pseudo identity. And so I took on this identity that was kind of part me and part the group, which is why when you leave high demand religion, the number one issue is people don't know who they are anymore. They leave and there's this real visceral fear of who the hell am I? Like, I don't know what I believe. I don't know what I value. I don't know what I even want. I don't know, I don't know who I am or where I'm going. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with my life or what my purpose is. And it's this real existential crisis because healing sort of requires you to be a little bit anchored into yourself and to know who you are at least. And there's no connection with the self. Often people leave high demand religion and they're disembodied, and it's so scary. Having gone through it myself, it is so scary to feel like there is no ground underneath your feet and you're floating and free falling and you have no idea where you're going to land or even who you're going to be when you do land.
How old were you when you left?
4 years ago, I was 37.
Mm.
Yeah. So
How quick
37
you
years.
rose too. And I'm sure it felt that it was going to take forever and ever and ever. And then consistent steps.
Yeah. I was really lucky. Part of the reason I got into coaching was Kevin, my husband, is a marriage and family therapist. And I have a background in psychology. We have a lot of friends who are therapists. We hang out with a lot of people who are therapists, or who are in the healing, like the healing area. They're coaches, they're therapists, they're spiritual leaders, those sorts of things. And when we left high demand religion, we were really lucky to know some people who had just gone through that a year or two before who also had that background. And they were able to sort of mentor us through it and listen to our anger and our pain and our confusion and our loneliness. So we were never completely alone, which is not something a lot of people get to experience. And we were never completely guideless because we had all of this built-in support. And about a year and a half into it, I started looking around because we were gathering ex-Mormons around us because I left Mormonism. So we were gathering ex-Mormons around us, and we started noticing a lot of people were still disembodied 2 years, 3 years later. And there wasn't that support. And the support couldn't be found. Like in the whole state of Colorado, there were no therapists that I knew that were doing religious trauma. It's only been in the last year that I've actually been able to start finding therapists that are actually putting on their website, I support religious trauma. I mean, it was impossible to find that 4 years ago.
I thank you for sharing that. I want to overlay Teri's experience to make it accessible for somebody who maybe hasn't had that sort of definitive religious experience. And correct me if I'm wrong, I could see, and this is just sort of what I've learned how trauma works, there's patterns. I can see how a high demand religion and the shutdown and the suppression and the fear of expression can sort of overlap with, high demand parents or parents
Yep.
who have large religious beliefs. Maybe you're not actually part of that religion, or high demand, even if you go to a school, like there's so many things that if you are listening right now, you may be able to find something that connects you with Teri's experience in your own transition, because of what we do, what we become, and what we're conditioned to be, how to be as children. Teri has such an experience that there's, you're finding words for it in this way, and the cult is a completely different experience that I think a lot of people don't understand, and so there's like that aspect. But I just want to make it accessible for everybody listening.
No, I'm so glad you did, because I think religious trauma, especially in America, is something all of us experience to a certain extent because of how intertwined religion is with just American society. Christianity in particular is very, very intertwined with our political system, our education system, our judicial system, even our mental health system has a lot of religious ideas woven through it. And there, we might not identify it as religious trauma, but like I have a client who's atheist, for instance, who identified as having religious trauma because of being treated as less than, or being treated as untrustworthy, or being treated as evil by people she went to school with, people she went to college with, and people she's worked with in her adult years, that left a mark on her self-esteem and on her sense of self-worth.
Where would you say, and I know in Brene Brown words it so beautifully, I've taken it from her over the last probably 2 months, and I say it all the time. Adam and I actually just released a podcast with Adam and me, finally talking about our health experience as a couple for the last 6 years. And it's, understanding that there's a long and winding road to healing and wholeness. Where would you say you are now as compared to that lost Teri?
So I would say that I'm at the place where I feel embodied most of the time. So I feel in touch with my emotions and my body and my thoughts most of the time. I still numb. I mean, I still am human. Sometimes I check out just like everybody. Sometimes I scroll social media or, whatever in order to numb out sometimes. That's just human. But I would say I spend most of the majority of my time embodied. My self-image and my self-worth has improved 100%. So I would say the majority of the time, I really do like who I am, and I'm my biggest advocate and probably my biggest friend. However, that being said, after 37 years of messages of not being enough, worrying about what people will think, those messages still come up, and I still have to address them and release them. So I would say I'm at that place where I feel whole, but I still have scars, if that makes sense. Like I feel like a whole functioning person. And in Braving the Wilderness, Brene actually talks about how when we go through these kinds of experiences, and in fact, I threw the book. I threw the book and would not read it.
That.
Yeah, I threw the book and would not read it for about a week because she's talking about this girl who actually it's a religious experience. She talks about leaving, like she was some influential person in religion and she decides to support LGBTQ, issues publicly, and her whole community is in uproar. And she talks about like walking your own path, and she says, and you get like she said you get to a place where you're dancing in the wilderness but you always walk with a limp. And I was like,
Ooh.
no. And I threw it. I was like, no, this church is not making me walk with a limp for the rest of my life. I was like, I refuse. I will be whole. I will run. I am not walking with a limp. And I threw it. And I was like, no, Brene, I usually love you. I hate you right now. And I threw that and I went off to read some other book. But it's been my experience that there's a limp there. There's a scar there. It's It doesn't hurt as much. It still hurts sometimes though. And like there are definitely tender places where I can be triggered, and there are definitely like things I'm having to learn at 41 that most people learn when they're 12 or 15 or 17. Like I'm having to learn how to make friends. We talked about that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm having to learn, I had to learn what bra to wear with a tank top. I didn't know how to do that. I remember my first time going to a coffee shop. I did not know what to order. I had never had coffee. The first time at a bar, I had no idea how to order alcohol. I called it alcohol. That's the other thing, is like you can tell a Mormon because they call it alcohol.
Hmm.
Like, do you want to go get some alcohol? Not, do you want to go get a drink? Um, so like little things like that. There's these little like things that I'm having to mature into and grow into as a 41-year-old that many people get to experiment with and figure out when they're in their teenage years and college years.
You know, and that it makes me think it's just like if those things were gone, would our humanity be gone? And is that humanity? And not is pain humanity? That's not what I mean in any sense. But those little limps or scars or trips, even sometimes they're not scars. Sometimes they're just like dumbass trips up the stair. You know, our humanity. And I think it's really important to note too, Teri, and I'm sure you've thought about this, and I think it's really good for the people listening, the leaders listening, that you have, you know, you got to figure out how to put on the right bra for a tank top, and yet you're still supporting people on top of people on top of people going through something, even in your own human process.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's really important.
Well, and I think there's something beautiful about owning our humanity and feeling comfortable in our humanity that gives permission to everyone around us to feel like, to almost breathe that sigh of relief and feel comfortable in their own humanity and to feel enough exactly as they are right now, with all of our bumps and bruises and scars and all of that, that we get to be enough. And I think there's something really beautiful about that. And I think there's also something that connects us from our experiences. From our experiences, if I had never experienced loss, if I had never experienced trauma, I wouldn't have a frame of reference when other people are grieving or experiencing loss or are feeling trauma. My experience has helped me understand, not completely, but a little bit, racial issues that I'm trying to, unravel, LGBTQ issues, death. I haven't experienced a lot of death, but losing my religion, losing my identity, I understand loss and grief. And so while I might not know someone else's experience, I know that feeling. And that's all that it takes to empathize, is I might not know what you've gone through, but I know that feeling that comes with it, and we can connect, and I can hold space for you because I know that feeling. So I think there is something very human and very beautiful about those scars, like you said.
Yeah. Emotion is emotion is emotion is emotion. And you brought up the losing your religion, and I want to move there because there was something else you just said in the losing. Oh, so when we feel lost, be it spiritual transition or not, when we feel lost, well, what does that mean? Well, that just means that we don't know where to go, meaning that we don't know where to look to find where to go, which means that we don't know where to look for answers, right? And Teri and I talked a little bit about this on her podcast, and I want to share it just to share another bit of a story, a separate side, and then I think this will lead us really beautifully into what we talked about before the show. So for those of you listening, I don't know if I've shared this on the podcast. If I did, it maybe was in like the first season somewhere way back when. My mother's side of the family was Catholic. My father's side of the family was Christian, hated Catholics, but loved the Bible. And I was closer to my father's side of the family. We were just closer. They were a larger family. We saw them more. And I felt very supported in my open-mindedness around them. They, however, weren't scared to tell me everything they were scared of based off of their interpretation of the Bible. And when I was 11, my mom had previously studied with Jehovah's Witness for a few years. One of my aunts also did. Never baptized, didn't go to congregation every Sunday, but studied like Bible studies every week. And I started studying with the Jehovah's Witnesses at 11 every Wednesday. Tanya, I still talk to her occasionally. She'd come over for Bible study. And the Bible wasn't new to me at the time because my family would read scriptures and wasn't completely new, but I did end up learning a lot of things. I learned a lot of scripture. I learned all the books. I could recite them, and what I thought that was like the coolest thing. And each week we'd learn this new concept. And there's some things that I think are a little bit irrelevant for this specific podcast that came up that felt diminishing in the interpretation. But actually, me in fourth grade, I almost wrote about this the other day. My family and I would talk about the nature of infinity and God and those things. That wasn't like totally untouched. And so I felt like I thought out of the box, but I'm looking back and like in fourth grade, I stopped standing for the Pledge of Allegiance because of my study with the Jehovah's Witnesses, which is crazy, especially like maybe not now, but like then it was crazy. Maybe I'd stand and not put my hand over my heart. I think that's what I did. On top of these other things, I wouldn't celebrate certain holidays in school because I wanted to be true to what I was studying, and it made sense to me at the time. And I ended up turning 17. So I studied till I was like 16 or 17, got a boyfriend, stopped studying. And I still wanted to. It wasn't that I didn't want to, I just did not make it a priority. Mm-hmm. And then some time went by. Actually, a lot of stuff happened. A lot of sexual abuse for me specifically happened from 17 to 24, many different men. And I remember in 2011, I was 22. Okay, I think that timeline is right. I had this deep spiritual awakening. I was already away from the Bible. I did pray. I did have these moments. I was living alone, and I had these moments in my apartment of night terrors. So bad at it. Turn on the light, open the Bible. I was living alone. That happened over and over and over and over again. And I went to the Bible. That's really important. Mm-hmm. And then I had this spiritual awakening. And what we were talking about on Teri's podcast was that I started not to trust what I saw as my Bible, the way that I interpreted it. I started not to trust some things about it. And so I stopped utilizing it, which wasn't an issue in the beginning. And then very shortly after, I was in this dark night of the soul that we also talked about. And there I was, I had lost my religion, and I started breaking down to my boyfriend, now Adam. So this was in the past 6 years. Like, I don't know what to do. And the place that I always went for answers is not available to me anymore. And I don't know where to look for answers anymore. And I felt that was my lost, right? In that moment, I lost my religion. Like, I realized it. And some time passed, and I continued to do my own study and my own work. Me specifically was very deep into ancient culture, other religious texts. I was seeing all these connections. That was sort of my path. And then I dropped back into the knowing that I had the answers in my body the whole time, and the power of trust and faith. And I'd like to sort of move into this because we were talking earlier that when you get away, like we want to retract from these religious conversations. We want to retract from the religious speech, the religious vocabulary. We want to retract from it all. Or maybe we've wanted to, even since we were like young, and we've never liked it, same deal. But once we start to do this self-search, we have mystical experiences that are ineffable, that can only be described as the religious texts do. And so we come to a point there. So I would love to hear any thoughts, obviously, and I would love to hear your, perspective on faith and trust in outside of a religion.
Okay. No, this is good. So this is big. So first of all, I want to talk about um, like where to turn for answers. So I went through something really similar. We learned a lot about the Holy Ghost and that was what guides us and like helps us know what to do next. And I had been told that if I ever turned my back on the religion, that I would lose that gift. And I was fully prepared. Like I was so sad because I relied on that a lot.
So you had had the experience of it.
Oh yeah, several
Okay.
times. It's intuition. That's what that is. That is intuition. So it was co-opted by my religion, and they said it was theirs to give me. It was mine all along, but they said it was theirs to give me, and that I would lose it. They would take, like, it would be taken back if I ever left. Um, and so it had been a guiding influence in my life. It was where I went for answers. I would pray and then wait for that like inner knowing, but I thought it was a special gift I was given when I was 8 years old and was baptized into the church. We're told that's when that gift is given to you, and that before any feelings you have like that is just the light of Christ, and that that's a temporary gift that you don't get to keep with you all the time. It's just something that like touches you occasionally, but when you're 8 and you're baptized, then you're given the gift of the Holy Ghost, and that guides you for the rest of your life as long as you're doing what the religion says. And so when I left, I was fully prepared to give up this gift because I was going against the organization that had gifted this to me. And I think what was really interesting was recognizing that not only did I not lose it, but that power got stronger because now I had even more access to my feelings, even more access to explore and get curious with my thoughts, even more access to like think outside of the box. And it's like that intuition that was inside of me just like expanded and filled my whole body instead of just being housed like right here, which is where I used to feel it. Like it radiates through my whole body and up through my head and out through my fingers. Like it's a tangible, physical like force that I can feel. Um, so yeah, that was kind of like you were talking about, like you used to go to the certain source, and I have a feeling you went to something very similar, which was that intuition inside of you that the answers were already there and they were coming from you all along. You were using the Bible or whatever scriptural text as like a conduit to open up your intuition, but it was always your intuition. It was never the text itself. It was always you. And so just like I use oracle cards sometimes to get my intuition going, or I'll use meditation sometimes to get my intuition going, um, that feeling, whether it's me, whether it's a higher power, like you said in the podcast, whether it's me or a higher power, it really doesn't matter to me anymore. But the answers are still there. Like that inner knowing is still there, and it's not owned by any religion or any religious text. It's something that is inherent to us. So that I think is one of the big things that I want to talk about as far as getting answers. And then that leads us into the faith and trust part, which is really, I feel like faith and trust are really intertwined. And when we talk about trust, I think it's a self trust. It's lately I've been studying joy, and I've recognized that part of the reason I've been able to expand into more joy is because when we open up to joy, there's, or, something that just means a lot to us, it makes us vibrate with excitement or whatever. Usually there's a fear of loss that comes along with it, because if I have this joyful thing, then there's a fear that that could be taken away. And so as I've allowed myself to hold myself in fear and hold myself in grief, it's allowed me to open up to more joy.
Wait. Somehow the volume on my phone on Facebook came on. I'm so sorry. Okay.
No, don't worry. So it's allowed me to open up to more joy because I can trust myself to handle loss should that happen. and I can trust myself to handle that fear. I can hold space for the fear while I'm experiencing joy. So I'm not afraid to feel fear or be overpowered by it. And I'm not afraid to be overpowered by loss or that I can't handle it. And knowing that about myself has created self-trust to allow me to expand into peace, into pleasure, into calm, into joy, into, just all of those things, receiving abundance, because all of those things come with like a little fear factor and a little like loss factor. That when we know that we can handle those difficult feelings, it allows us to expand into the feelings that we're actually hoping to experience. So that self-trust also goes with faith, because faith is really just knowing that you'll catch yourself. It's really, for me, all faith is knowing that no matter what happens, I have enough experience feeling through hard things. I have enough experience knowing that I'm going to pick myself back up and that I'm going to be there for myself, that I know I'm going to get through whatever comes. So, yeah,
And
I don't know.
what because I'm thinking about the person who doesn't trust themselves in the discomfort, right? And I think you said it really, really beautifully. Like, it's not about, moving ourselves into happiness can feel really scary, because if we're happy, we are then vulnerable because we're not looking out for things that could crash and burn, and then that could lead to pain. But it's not really about, well, what happens if I'm happy? It's not about the thing that would happen. It's about the emotion that we would experience with that thing, and trusting that I know pretty well how to handle loss. I know pretty well how to handle anger. I know pretty well how to handle fill in the blank. And I'm thinking about the person who doesn't know if they can handle that well, or who hasn't, I hear somebody now just saying like, well, I haven't experienced great loss or great pain or great sickness or great, like, how do I expect that not to happen? And I also, at that same time, so that's like A, to that person who doesn't know if they can trust, which leads me into B of, like, I found, and I'm sure you found, when you were person A, you were still person B. You just hadn't looked at your history hard enough.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I remember shortly before being diagnosed with clinical depression, almost like berating myself, because I felt like I would feel this like sort of muted sadness that I didn't want to feel, and muted rage, if I'm being honest, because anger was not okay. So those were like suppressed emotions. And I remember feeling like I don't have anything to feel angry or sad about because I haven't ever experienced loss, but that's not true. I had experienced loss of friendships. I had experienced breakups. Even if you graduated high school and moved away from home, even if it's down the street, you've experienced the loss of how your life used to be. You've experienced, any time we expand into a new chapter of our lives, there's a closing of an old chapter of our life. And there is grief and loss with that. So, yeah, I had experienced loss. I just was unaware of it because I was so out of tune with my body. Um, yeah.
That sentence, you had experienced loss, but you were so unaware of it because you were out of tune with your body. First of all, mind body mentor here. I love all the things body and emotion. But that reminded me, on your podcast we recorded, how people want to succeed, and sometimes people see that the successful people had hard times and came from really dramatic histories. And so what happens subconsciously is the person will then create drama for themselves to try to create this beautiful life. And like, it's just not necessary at all. That's the ice cream man. I thought it was coming from you. I'm like, I think Teri, there's an ice cream man around outside Teri's window, but it's, I don't know. He must have been here for like 10 minutes. I literally live on one road. I live on a cul-de-sac that's off of a road that's like a 16th of a mile. And then there's one other little cul-de-sac off of mine. Like, I don't understand why he's still here. Unless everybody's getting ice cream. I don't know.
Or maybe this is just like a quiet road for him to just hang out on and like catch his breath before he goes and like sells some more ice cream. Oh, no, I love that you brought up that it doesn't have to be big trauma. And I think that that is so important. Honestly, if I had been more in tune with my emotions, I would have been able to empathize with loss, even with the breakups I had experienced, the friendship shifts that I experienced in middle and high school, the, just the loss of closeness with my grandparents in high school. I grew up and became a teenager. They're little kid people. They don't know what to do with teenagers. They end up pushing us away because they can't handle what feels like rejection to them when we start choosing our friends instead of hanging out at their house. And so that was a loss. Like I had lots of little losses. I could have empathized with loss. I could have empathized, but I hadn't explored loss because I had just shoved it down and put it in a little box. But all of those allow us to empathize with people. Um, it doesn't have to be huge traumatic loss in
Yeah,
order
and
for
we
us to
don't have to
understand.
create that in our lives, because I think a lot of us create it. I think, and this is that double truth. Everything is necessary, and a lot of it isn't necessary. So
Yeah.
I wonder how you started then, because if I'm hearing you correctly, and maybe this is my bias, you started creating more trust, self-trust, and faith in the process when you started connecting to your body. And then I
Yes.
wonder how did you start connecting to your body? And I don't remember if we did a somatic alchemy session. I'm
I
trying to
don't think
remember.
we did.
I don't
I
think
don't
we
think
ever
we
did.
did. So, yeah, so 11 years ago, I was diagnosed with clinical depression. And I was diagnosed because I was disembodied and really pissed about it. I didn't realize that was what was going on at the time, but I had put myself into such a small box and only a very small portion of me was acceptable. And I was pissed off about that because I don't want to be in the box. Like I didn't fit that narrative, and I honestly I sucked at being the person in the box. Like I was not good at being the quiet, submissive, gentle, like 1950s wife. Like that was what I was trying to be.
You got the voice down, Pat.
Oh my God. Yeah. Yeah. I used to
Was
try
that
to
your voice? Was that how
I
you
don't
would speak?
I think I spoke a little bit like this, but I'm a lot more forceful in my language. Like I
Mm.
speak a lot less carefully. So, but no, I think I did speak a lot more. I was a lot more subdued. I wasn't even as excited or as like
Colorful.
vibrant. Yeah. So I was just a lot more subdued, and I actually see it in family members as well who've been members of the church for a while. Their family members who are not members will talk to me about them and talk about how vibrant and funny, and now they've like lost their sense of humor and they've lost their
Mm.
ability to laugh. And I mean, one of the things I covenanted to do was not loudly laugh. That was, yeah,
Wow.
when I was 19 I made a covenant not to engage in loud laughter. So
You made that yourself.
uh-huh.
Wow.
Granted, I went to the temple to make these covenants without full knowledge of what I was going to be covenanting to. Even though I took all the prep classes, I still didn't really know what the covenants were. And then they asked me if I wanted to leave before I knew what the covenants were. Like that was never, consent was not a thing. So it wasn't like spelled out for me, like, this is what you're going to covenant to. And if you're
And
not cool
can
with
you,
that,
that's a promise to the,
to
your
God,
place. That's
you're,
okay.
yeah, it's a promise to God. So yeah, I covenanted at the age of 19, no loud laughter, no evil speaking of the Lord's anointed, no taking of the name of God in vain. Like, lots of little things. And so loud laughter, like I've watched family members lose the ability to like
Mm.
laugh and joke and just be like jovial and in their body because they're so like, there's this like subconscious uptightness about just being too much.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then how did you start getting into like reading the feedback of your body?
Yeah, so I started with CBT therapy and that did not work very well for me. So trying to catch my thoughts as they were happening,
Mm.
it didn't work very well for me. I mean, so I had like a practice where I'd sit down and try to think, like try to pay attention to what I was thinking. My
I feel like that
husband,
doesn't work until you've already practiced outside. Like you've already practiced other things. And then like now I'm so practiced, I can sort of see the thoughts before they come up. Anyways.
yeah, so I like struggled with that for probably 3 years. And my husband was getting his master's degree to be a therapist at this time. And so in year 4, he started studying emotionally focused therapy, which is a couples therapy that's actually really effective for couples problems. And it has to do with attachment theory
Hmm.
and Carl Jung's work. And so, anyway, I remember him coming home and telling me he was reading this book by Fredrickson, Roger. I don't remember what his first name is, but Fredrickson is his last name. And there was this. He was like, "Here, like we laid in our bed, and he was like, we're gonna do this quiz. It's gonna be great." And he read me this quote first that was like, "Emotions are neither good nor bad; they just are." And it's like something went off in me, and I was like, "Wait, what?" I was like, "But what about anger? Like, surely." And Kevin's like, "No, anger is just an alarm bell that tells you that something's wrong. That's really all it is it's just the smoke alarm that's like, hey, something's on fire. You should probably check that out." And I was like, "Are you kidding me?" I was like, "Well, what about like fear?" And he was like, "Fear just is letting you know you feel unsafe. That's it. Like, hey, you probably missed this. Like, something's going on." And I was like, "What?" So he was like, "Yeah, feeling all of your feelings, like, those are just messengers. That's it. And they're not good or bad. Like, we're the ones that place value on them, but they're not inherently good or bad. They're just messages from inside of us about what's going on outside of us." And I was like, "What the heck?" So that like opened me up. And then we did this quiz and we went through what all of our different feelings felt like in our body, like what we talked about.
Mm.
And he had me like imagine a time I was really angry and just pay attention to the physiological feelings in my book or in my body. The book is called Living Like You Mean It. And yeah, it goes through like,
That's where the quiz is from?
yeah, it's called Living Like You Mean It. And he goes through like 6 or 8 main emotions. I don't remember. And he like has this full, like has you think of something where you were like really afraid and like pay attention to what is your heart doing? What is your skin doing? Like, what are your hands doing? Just paying attention to all of that. And that right there, like just that little piece, it all happened in one night where I learned it. It took me 2 years to really master it, but I learned it all in one night. And I was like, okay, it's okay to feel. And this is what my feelings feel like in my body. And then I just started taking time every day to like check in with like, what does my body feel like? And what emotion do I think that is? And I had timers because I'm such a dork. I had timers on my phone to like check in. So
Oh,
I had a
I have my client, they're setting belly breath alarms. No, I love that.
So yeah, I had a timer in the morning and I had a timer like mid-morning, one at lunch, one mid-afternoon, and then at night I would check in with myself just to like get used to like what is the climate inside of my body. And I didn't even try to do anything with the emotions. It was just, can I name the emotion? What is the emotion I'm feeling? What am I experiencing right now? And as I practiced that language, because really that's all emotions are, they're just a language. As I practiced the language, I got better at like interpreting it. And then that's when the magic started happening at church because I was at church and I would be, I would just be like subconsciously checking in on myself because I had set those timers and I'd gotten so used to it. And I'd be sitting in
This is
church.
before you left or after you
This is
left at a different
before I
church?
left. This
Oh,
is all before I left. Um, and there were like 2, 3 years before I left the church where I'd be sitting in women's group and I'd be like, I'm feeling shame right now.
oh,
Why am I feeling shame right now? Or I'd be like, I'm feeling anxiety. Why am I feeling anxiety? And like tracing those feelings back the way Kevin calls it a bottom up approach. I would feel the emotion and I would trace it up to my thought.
Mm.
And that worked so well, to take the emotion and be like, okay, this is what I'm feeling. What's the thought that's creating this emotion? And like pinpointing the thought and then being like, well, what created that thought? Like, where did that thought come from? And like just getting curious with it. I was like, holy crap. Like, I'm getting like a steady feed of shame and fear at church primarily. Like, I would feel some joy and I would feel some connection, but like loneliness was a big emotion I was feeling at church. Shame was a huge emotion. Fear was a huge emotion. And then I would notice throughout the week, I would get this big dose of it. I'd be really like a big ball of just crazy on Sunday evening. Monday, you know, I'm feeling through things, I'm releasing things. Tuesday, it gets a little better. Wednesday, I'm feeling pretty good. Friday, Saturday, I'm great. I'm feeling really good on Friday, Saturday. And I'm thinking it's because it's the weekend, but no, it's just I've released all the fear and shame. Then I go back to church on Sunday and just it would all get piled back on. And I started noticing this is an unhealthy cycle. This is not okay. And honestly, that's why I left. It was just mentally and emotionally unhealthy for me.
What a fantastic picture you just painted. I want to know, because in my work with emotions and my own personal work and my work with my students, and I think that I see the answer, but I know that something can happen is we could be on this podcast right now. I could check in with my body. I could be feeling shame.
Mm-hmm.
How often was that shame that was self-projected and not out here? Like, how did you discern what was shame, actually somebody shaming you versus something causing shame internally?
Honestly, I didn't get good at that until just a couple of years ago, after
Oh,
I'd already left.
because when I was listening to you, it sounded the way that you approached it. And I think this is really good for people to hear, because what I think something that is really effective is becoming like emotional intelligence is so wonderfully important, and listening to the feedback of the body is what I teach, and like I'm here for it. And I think people can get emotionally intelligent and be like, oh, I'm feeling anxiety, oh, I'm feeling shame, it must be this person in front of me, or oh, I'm feeling love, it must be this person in front of me, but really it's an internal thing that's happening based off of trauma. And when you were speaking with that bottom up approach, which I totally believe in, it sounded like you felt it in your body. You grabbed a thought, and then you followed that thought to its source. And so I could presume if you followed a thought to somebody, to a woman who was at that time making a shameful comment, or a man who was making a shameful comment, I guess we would know what a shameful comment is, because you understand shame. Like, don't do this, you're bad if you do this. And so it
Yeah.
sounded like you had that, and maybe it was really subconscious, but it really sounded like you had that awareness there. And it's probably from what you were studying at the time.
So honestly, I was still in the mindset that if I was feeling shame, it must be my fault that I was misinterpreting it. So that's the reason I
Okay.
wasn't. Does that make sense? So I was noticing I'm feeling shame and I was tracing it to my thoughts, but I hadn't quite made
You
the
stopped
connection.
there.
Yeah, I hadn't quite made the connection that what was being taught to me was shameful, and that was the reason I was feeling shame.
Okay.
So it wasn't until when I made that connection, I left.
Okay. And then once that separation happened, I'm sure you saw more connections.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Because then I was free to explore outside the box. There wasn't that barrier there. A lot of times people are like, you're lying to yourself, but that's not what's happening in high demand religion. Your brain literally protects you. It's not a conscious choice to lie to yourself. Your brain is like, yeah, I mean, people have compared leaving a high demand religion to social suicide, because you lose all of your community and connections, because it's usually a really insular experience where I like all of my friends, all of my family were in the organization. Leaving really felt like death. It really felt like I lost all sense of belonging. And so it was it was the scariest experience I've ever gone through in my entire life, is knowing that I would be on my own. And I was so grateful Kevin was coming with me, but we felt like a little island.
Tell me what you
So
mean by, if people, some people assume that you're lying to yourself. Do you mean when you're out of the high demand religion, or in it?
no, so people on the outside of the religion
Yeah.
think that people inside, this is what I hear a lot from people who have never been a part of a high demand religion. They're like, surely you had to know that some of these things weren't true. Like, you're an educated
Just like
person.
not, just like, I'm just not going to look over there.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's not at all what's going on. It's not like I'm like, oh yeah, this is all whack, but I'm just not going to look at it. Like, there's literally a mental block. I know neurosurgeons. I know like astrophysicists. I know rocket scientists and engineers, like highly educated people with doctorate degrees that don't like, they question everything, but their brain blocks their ability to question their religion. It's like there is a wall there that they're not even aware of.
You're saying these people would show you evidence for this? Is that what you're
No,
saying?
I'm saying these people are unaware of it. Like, I thought I was an open-minded, critical thinking person inside the church, and I was, for everything that didn't have to do with my religion. There was a wall there that my brain kept me from applying what I was learning to my religious beliefs. Like, it never crossed over until it did. And then it feels like the Matrix. Like, it's like I woke up and then I couldn't unsee what I had seen.
Isn't that the shit? You wake up and you just can't unsee. I feel that.
Yeah.
And then you try to not see, and
Oh
then
my
you
gosh.
get in the shits deeper and you see more that you can't unsee. It's just this crazy expansion, ride of expansion. And again, like, I think people, although the situation is different, I think people could probably relate to that in family, in family situations. I know I related to that in my work life. A long time ago, I was living with the people I was working with. I was working 70 hours a week. My friends were at work. We went out with people at work. My boyfriend was the boss. Like, and I was surrounded, and it was very abusive, but I stayed. And like, I didn't think there was any other way. And it definitely wasn't since I was a little girl. And it definitely, but I could see, I could only start to imagine the intensity of just growing up in an environment like that, and just, learning the normal things, and the conditioning is tough enough in, for a kid that a normal everyday kid, let alone somebody who's just like in a pit of a, what do you call it? Like, not a sounding board, but it's like you're in your own little environment where everything's reflecting off of each other and coming back to you. There's a name for it. It's not coming to me, but it's just like everybody's believes the same things. They talk about the same things.
Yeah.
You're not getting out of it.
Yeah. Everywhere you look, everything reaffirms what you think is reality, because everyone's living in that same set of limits.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Let me peek at my notes. Yeah, so maybe we could wrap up. I would like to hear, because you work with religious and spiritual transition, you work with people, all different types. Mm-hmm. And I would like to hear, like, what's the first thing that comes up for you if I ask you what people experience the most that they think they're alone in?
Let me think about that for a minute. Mm-hmm. What's coming up for me very first is this idea that no one understands their experience, that their experience is so different or so unique that no one can empathize with it, no one can understand. It's kind of what's coming up first. It's just this idea that they're alone and that they have to deal with it alone, and that there is no support because no one's experienced it quite like they have. Mm-hmm. So Go ahead.
No, I could see that was a difficult question to answer. And I think that you probably hit the nail on the head, because when we're feeling, when I sought out therapy, or when I sought out coaching that was not for business, therapy was my first version of that. When I sought out therapy, I felt like a victim to my circumstances. And there's this thing where it's like you get caught in the explanation of trying to explain everything that's happening, because you feel alone and you want them to understand, and you want them to see why you're the only one who should be able to do this or feel like this, and it's rarely the case. And I think it's really good to bring up. And I think that's why conversations like this are so good, and raw conversations are like this are so good, because even in just this podcast alone, you talked about your very movie-esque high demand religion experience. We talked about my just different religions, different beliefs, my experience, and been able to relate on so many different levels. And it comes back to what we said before, that emotion is emotion is emotion. And that, in what I see, is what it all boils down to. And so if we can become aware of the emotion that we're experiencing, I don't think the story actually matters.
Mm-mm. Well, and that's one of the things I've realized, is that I think, I've talked with people who don't identify as having religious trauma, but have trauma from coming out of the closet in the LGBTQ community. I've talked with people who don't identify as having religious trauma, but have sexual trauma. I've talked with people who have had narcissistic or abusive partners. Just all these different, the emotions are all the same. Like, we all experience the same loss, the same grief, even that same sense of, who am I? There's the same identity reclamation that has to happen. There's the same moving through the grief process. There's the same restructuring and rebuilding afterwards. And the emotions are largely the same, regardless of the actual story. The experience is very, very similar.
And I do think that once I felt safe in sharing my story from my growth, right? In my growing process, not sharing my story as a victim, listen to me, I want attention because I've been there, but sharing my story in my growth process and sharing those parts that I felt alone in, I've started to create women around me who've had similar experiences. And like you said in the beginning, you're surrounded by all these therapists or therapy-like people, and they are out there. People are out there. There's so many people out there with so many different experiences, that your people are out there.
Yeah. Well, and I love that you bring up, when you allow yourself to show up and own your story, when the story isn't owning you, but you're owning your story, that's a very vulnerable and authentic place of being, of, this is me, this is what I've experienced, this is how I'm growing, this is where I'm still figuring myself out. There's something so magnetic about that. And it just draws people into you that understand and that get that. That's a big thing for people who are going through religious transition or trauma, is so often we feel alone because of that social suicide that we talked about earlier, losing a whole community. And a lot of times people will ask, how do I build community? And I often say, you show up as authentically as possible. And you put it out there. I was you learn to belong to yourself. You show up as authentically as possible, and it calls in the people that resonate with who you are. So, yeah.
Well, Teri, I think it's about that time.
Thank you so much. This has been fun.
Yeah, so fun. I wish it wasn't later, or else I'd be like, yeah, let's go another. It's 7:30 by me though. So why don't you remind people again of your podcast, which we have a podcast coming out on Teri's on Sunday. Actually, if you're listening to this podcast on my podcast, it's already going to be out because this isn't going to go out for a few weeks. So if you're watching live or watching the replay, it's happening on Sunday. But why don't you just share your podcast again, and then anything that's currently exciting, and if people have questions or anything, like all that good stuff.
Absolutely. So the podcast is called the Emancipate Your Mind podcast, and it's available on all the podcast directories. You can find it anywhere. So type in Emancipate Your Mind, and the picture looks like a woman whose mind is exploding with all kinds of color and like music notes, and it's so fun. Currently, if this is resonating with you, I have a Facebook group that's called Emancipate Yourself, and we talk about all the topics from the podcast a little bit more in depth. I ask questions, we start discussions. It's starting to pick up. I started the group at the beginning of the year when I started the podcast, and it's starting to pick up. We're starting to get more involvement and people that want to show up and be seen. Religious trauma is one of those things where sometimes you want to just hide and like ingest things and you don't want to show up, but people are starting to show up and it's starting to grow and people are starting to engage in discussions. So it's getting really exciting over there. And yeah, or you can follow me on Instagram. I'm Emancipated Molly. That was my like pseudonym when I very first got started, and I didn't want to be public with my own name. So that's how I got started with the coaching and like talking about all of this stuff, where I was able to have a voice, but not like out myself. And so I kept that. And yeah, and now I just use my own name as well because I don't mind. Like I can stir the pot. It's fine. I'm strong enough to handle that.
Has it always been Emancipated Molly? Because I thought you just changed it.
So I've had my Emancipated Molly account for 3 years now, I think. But when I was with you guys, I had started another coaching account because I was going to coach people through all the symptoms of religious trauma without actually owning the fact that I was talking about religious trauma. So I was going to talk about perfectionism and people pleasing and shame resilience and like all these things. And then
I remember when you owned it, now that you mention it.
Yeah.
I think that happened when we were together.
Yep. So I finally came out public. I came out of the religious trauma closet and was like, oh, okay, this is the kind of coaching I'm doing. Like, let's just like talk about this. And, pissed off a bunch of people and had a lot of fun with that. So.
And is making an impact with her top-rated podcast.
It is. I love it.
Do you have a link tree, or if you have a link tree, send it to me. If you not, I will put all of Teri's information in the show notes on my podcast when it comes out. So you guys can just check that out if you want. And well, thank you. Can't wait to listen to ours. And yes, thank you so much.
No, you're so welcome. This was so much fun.
Okay, I'm going to stop the live on Facebook. Bye, guys. Oh, we're still live on Facebook, but recording is stopped.